Hi, I'm Jasmine Gunkel, and today, or whatever day it is for you in the void, I'm going to be talking to you about intimacy and getting at what it is. So, as you probably have noticed, analytic philosophy has not paid much attention to intimacy. And so, to start with, I'm going to present a couple puzzles that I think motivate why it is so important to talk about and get an account of. Okay, so I take it to be somewhat obvious that it's more violating for a stranger to grab our thigh or to stroke our face than it would be for them to touch something like our fingernail, for instance. Uh, why is that, right? Similarly, it's worse for someone to read our diary without permission or our journal, a personal journal, than it would be for them to read our bird watching field notes, right, without our permission, all else being equal. But why is that, right? So I think on some level, it seems kind of obvious, right? And there's some things we could say here, uh, like some things are more private than others, right? A thigh, a journal, that's more private than a fingernail or bird watching field notes. Or some violations of autonomy, right, are more severe than others when people are encroaching on our autonomous zones. But I think there's something unsatisfactory, right, about some of these answers, because they can give us new terms to understand the kinds of violations at hand, but they don't tell us why exactly some actions are more likely to be violations of this kind, right, nor why some actions are more severe than others. And so I think in there's some similarities in these cases, right? Something that's underlying both of them. And I think that's intimacy, right? So understanding intimacy can help us understand both of these kinds of puzzles. And so I'm thinking of this as a kind of Carnapian explication project. So I'm not trying to define intimacy in a way that is going to match up with every instance of how it's used out there in the world. I think this would be very difficult to do and not that fruitful. So instead, what I'm trying to do is get an account of intimacy that's at least mostly according with how people use it, and that can explain the previous puzzles, and then ground various intimate duties we have, and explain why some kinds of intimate violations, right, are so severe, and intimate violations in general, why they're more severe than other kinds of violations. And so I also hope that this account can give us some insight into intimate labor. So intimate labor is typically taken to mean things like sex work, surrogacy, maybe care work, but I think the category is actually much broader than that. So take, for instance, also nursing, art, therapy, teaching. I think all of these have intimate components to them. And we can see this when we have a better understanding of intimacy. And then we can treat all these kinds of labors more fairly, right? More similarly to each other. Okay, so the big goals of today. So first, I want to present and defend the intimate zone's account of intimacy. And that's what I call it. And so I'm going to explain, I hope, in a satisfactory way to you, why it works better than the main contender. And the main contender, I call a set of views. There are a set of views I call relationship first accounts. And so this is not the name given to them by their proponents because a lot of people are not really officially proponents of this view, given that a lot of people aren't explicitly grappling with what intimacy is. Although maybe a couple are, and I also want this to then fit with what's being kind of said when intimacy is sort of hinted to in their literature and some other projects. Okay, and so the second thing I want to do is explain, give an account of what an intimate zone actually is, right? So after hopefully convincing you that the intimate zone's account of intimacy is right, is the best understanding of intimacy, that I want to say, and look, and here's precisely what an intimate zone is. Here are two conditions on it, and I think together they're necessary and sufficient to be an intimate zone. So you could accept the first goal without being on board for the second, but I hope you'll be on board for both. Okay, so the intimate zones account. Basically, the main thesis is that intimate zones of persons are primary, right? And this is what grounds intimacy. So I think we can only understand intimacy as a unified phenomenon when we start with understanding intimate zones of persons. So I think these are the building blocks of intimacy, from which we can have intimate acts and intimate relationships. So what exactly is an intimate zone? An intimate zone is a feature of a person which renders them vulnerable. And these are features which, the two conditions I'm positing, we are disposed to hide, hiddenness condition, and which give insight into how we see ourselves, the importance condition. And then there's intimate acts, which are built up from these intimate zones. And an intimate act is an act that exposes at least one intimate zone, right? Straightforward. And an intimate relationship is a relationship in which intimate zones are exposed by the performance of intimate acts, intimate star acts, because I think sometimes, though a single act may not itself be intimate, a series of acts could be, right? When each act individually alone is not. I can say more about that in the questions if you're interested. Okay, so the main contrasting view, relationship first accounts. So relationship first accounts are instead positing that we should start from understanding relationships first, right, to understand intimacy. So an act is intimate in virtue of its actually or typically being performed in certain types of relationships or from motivations which arise within those relationships. So Julian S. Has a book which I think lays out the motivation account, or what I'm calling the motivation account. Mackie Little, in a paper I'm going to talk about later too, gives something I'm going to call the intertwinement account, which I think are both this sort of view, relationship first accounts. And I think this is also quite common in a lot of the accounts given by feminist philosophers in general when they're talking about things that are intimate or kind of intimacy adjacent, and care ethicists, right, where they are really starting from understanding relationships first. And so I think these sorts of accounts can be a really helpful tool, right, for understanding intimate relationships, describing kind of, some subset of what intimacy is, but I don't think they're foundational. So I don't think relationships are ultimately going to be able to give us a unified and complete understanding of intimacy and why it's so important. And so why do I think this is the case? So there are some problem cases for these relationship first kinds of views. So the first kind I'm calling minimal relationship cases, and the second I'm calling no relationship cases. So these are cases in which there appears to be intimacy and yet no relationship. So I think it shows us that we cannot just get all the intimate acts to fall out from an understanding of intimate relationships. So one kind of minimal relationship case, right, is an example called support group. So you can imagine someone is going to a support group to treat their alcohol dependency. And so they kind of sneak into the support group at the end after the session has begun, but in it, they share a lot of what seemingly intimate details of their life, right? They share this struggle that they don't talk about with most people, about significant problems it's caused in their life, how it's affected, their relationship and health, things that normally they would be quite uncomfortable sharing. And they listen to other people's stories too, but they don't get to know these people, right? They, for some reason, leave after it's done. They don't socialize with people. So the relationship that exists, if it does, is very minimal. And additionally, I think there's also no relationship cases. So now imagine instead someone is posting about some, what we would call an intimate relationship problem or something like that on a forum. And so they don't know these people. It's not even like there is necessarily extended back and forth. They're just going to post this story and then hope that some other people are going to give them advice, other anonymous people who they haven't built a relationship with, even in this anonymous forum. But it still seems, right, like you can have an intimate action there, right? You can post information of yourself, about yourself, that seems like it's intimate, right? It seems like an intimate action still. It's also, right, stranger on a train. I want to imagine, right? So someone is on a train in a foreign country, and they realize because they don't speak the language very well, they've gotten lost, they're hours in the wrong direction, and they start to cry on this train ride. And someone, a nice person, asks them what's wrong, gives them some helpful directions, and then they spend some time talking with each other about, why they both like to travel and what's scary about being alone in a country where you don't speak the language very well, and things like that. So they have this, it seems like a genuine connection, but it's very brief, right? And, it doesn't seem like they're ever going to see each other again. So I want to say in these cases, there isn't a relationship there, or at least not a very thick one, right? And especially in the forum case, I think that comes out. And yet it still seems like there can be intimacy without this relationship. So these are the sorts of cases I want to consider. And so for Inessa's motivation account, she explicitly rejects what she calls behaviorist approaches to understanding intimacy. So by this, she says something like, look, I don't think that we can say a kiss is going to be intimate because kisses can have all different kinds of meanings in various times and places, and it's not always intimate, right? So she doesn't want to identify intimacy with any particular behavior. And so I think she's right about this. And this is why I think rather than identifying it with, just a list of behaviors, we have to give certain characteristics of these kinds of behaviors and how people feel about a behavior, right? And in identifying the feelings people have and the psychological role that is being filtered, then we can get away from this behaviorist critique. Okay, so second condition. So after she rejects this, she posits her own condition on intimacy, right? And she says that intimacy is that which draws its motivation, meaning, and value from love, liking, or care. So, that a kiss could be intimate if it is drawing its motivation, like its meaning, its value from the fact that you love someone, right? That's what makes it intimate. So I think there's a problem here. If we have too thick of a notion of this loving, liking, and care that's required, then it's going to be too narrow, right? What acts count as intimate. Because it seems like, right, in these minimal and no relationship cases, the sort of care, there might be a little bit of care, right? But it's not very significant. So if you have a really thick notion of care, right, where you're caring so deeply about someone, those are going to be excluded because you don't really care that much, right, about the stranger on a train or the people in your support group, for instance, even though you might care a little bit, right? But so if you go the other way and say, well, caring just a little bit about them is fine, then the problem is what counts as an intimate act is going to be too wide, right? So the same kind of care that you might have for someone in the support group or the stranger on a train, you probably also have for your neighbor, right? And you can be motivated to hold the door open for your neighbors. You see them walking outside some kind of community apartment gate. But it doesn't really seem like that's intimate, right? Holding doors open for people, even if it's done out of a kind of care, right? And it does indeed draw some value from like it being this act of neighborly affection. However, I don't think it's going to work, right, for these reasons. So briefly talk about this intertwinement account too, that Maggie Little gives. So this isn't very explicit, but right in her paper where she talks about pregnancy as a kind of intimacy and the reason it's so important that people aren't forced to gestate, right, is because it's an intimate kind of wrong. Pregnancy is really intimate. You can't force people to be that intimate. And so she has a passing line about intimacy being a kind of intertwinement. And so I think, right, this can sounds good for some cases when we're talking about, really intimate relationships like that, like pregnancy. But of course, the minimal and no relationship cases are going to be excluded because our lives often aren't very intertwined, right, in those cases. And so then I think some even more interesting cases, right? You can imagine that your electrical wiring is faulty, such that when you turn on your air conditioner, your neighbor's apartment, their kitchen lights go out, right? And so this could be a really deeply intertwined lives you could have, as you have to think about, oh, are they making food right now? Is it hot out? Do they have the AC on? But this isn't the kind of intertwinement that's necessary for intimacy. So I think, right, we can have intertwinement without intimacy and intimacy without intertwinement. So now that I hope I have convinced you that we ought to start with intimate zones, I'm going to briefly talk about what it is that I think intimate zones are. So first off, I have the hiddenness condition. So this is just the following condition. A feature X of a person is hidden if and only if the person is disposed to hide X and would feel psychological discomfort at X is being exposed to a general audience, right? Keep it to ourselves in some way. And so importantly, this is not entailing that it's never publicly shared, right? Because you can have a disposition to keep something hidden while still sharing it sometimes, right? So for instance, if someone was sexually assaulted, they might decide during the Me Too movement to publicly share this. But it doesn't entail, right, that it's not private, because they could still feel a kind of psychological discomfort at this being shared, right? It makes them feel very vulnerable. They're deeply concerned about people's reactions to this. But of course, this could change over time, right? So the fact that this happened to them could eventually become not an intimate fact about them, because they could come to feel so comfortable sharing it and talking openly about it. And so importantly too, this disposition requires that the norm is actually internalized, right? And it's not just mere fear of some external consequence that keeps us from exposing ourselves in this way, right? So we can imagine someone who is a nudist, right? And they just do not at all feel uncomfortable about having their naked body out in public, but they keep it clothed generally for reasons, like legal reasons, right? So it's not actually an intimate zone then, their naked body for them. And so the importance condition, the second one, a feature X of a person is important if and only if they believe, fear, or worry that X reveals a facet of their identity. And so this bit about not just being a belief, but also a fear or worry is really important. I could talk more about that in Q&A. So importantly, this is distinct from what is actually a part of someone's identity, because there might be some things that are, objectively important parts of our identity, but which don't play an important psychological role in us, because we don't realize that they are, right? And importantly too, social stigma, societal pressures can all affect what it is that we believe, fear, or worry is part of our identity. So, for instance, right, because we live in a society that doesn't treat fatness very well, right? There's a lot of social stigma. It would be not uncommon for many larger people to internalize this kind of stigma, right? And worry or fear that the way they look is important, right? It's indicative that they have some personality flaw, right? That fatness is synonymous with laziness or something like this. And so in this way, right, societal pressures can affect what we feel as a part of our identity. And so what features of us are actually going to be intimate. But of course, these aren't determinate, right? Even though there's societal pressure that says, sexuality is an intimate feature, not everyone actually internalizes that and necessarily feels that way, right? Some people could feel much more comfortable sharing that openly, so not wanting it to be hidden and not thinking that it's really deeply connected to who they are. And so finally, just briefly, why these things work together, the importance condition and the hiddenness condition, to make us vulnerable to shame. So we don't have much experience with other people's reactions to us. And when we think that a feature is related to our identity, right? It's not just something that's kind of incidental, right? It's not, so shame tends to be connected to features of ourselves that we think are related to who we are, right? We feel guilt about an action we did that was wrong. We feel shame about who we are. And so because hiddenness and the importance work together in this way, they make it such that we're really vulnerable to shame regarding our intimate features. And I think this is at least doing part of the work to explain why it is that we have such strong intimate rights and duties to guard others in this way. So this is going to do the grounding work there. Happy to talk more about that if you're interested. Okay, thank you very much. I am looking forward to your questions.